Welcome back, everyone. We're diving deep today into something pretty significant.
Yeah, this is big stuff.
It's the National Security Commission on Emerging Biotechnology. They call it NSCB. And they just released this week what they're calling their final report.
A report chock full of practical recommendations to help the U.S. keep its edge in biotech, a field moving at just a breakneck speed.
So that's exactly what we're going to do for you today. Try and break down this final report. What's it all about? What's it mean for the U.S., especially with all this, competition heating up around the world? And the report really zeroes in on the challenge from China.
Right, yeah, and this report, it's
Yeah.
broad. It touches on national security. And you know how resilient our economy is? Health, food security,
Yeah.
energy, all through the lens of, you guess it, biotech.
And one thing that really stuck out to me right away was the sense of urgency. That runs through the whole thing. The final report, they say we've got like a 3-year window to get our act together, or we risk falling behind China in biotech. And that, they say, could be a setback that we might never bounce back from.
Yeah, it's a pretty stark warning.
So let's get into it. The report lays out 6 sort of core pillars for what needs to happen. So the first one is prioritizing biotechnology at the national level.
And the report, it starts off with
Yeah.
a pretty interesting assessment of where things stand right now. You know, the U.S. government, there's tons of biotech activity, but a lot of it is happening
Yeah.
in silos. Each agency's kind of doing its own thing. We're missing that, big picture strategy and that coordination across the board.
Yeah, it's like, I don't know, like a bunch of really talented musicians, but they're all playing different tunes. Nobody's leading the orchestra. So the final report, their solution, is a National Biotechnology Coordination Office,
Or NBCO, for sure,
NBCO.
which would be the conductor in this metaphor.
Yeah.
Bringing everything together, setting the long-term strategy, being the point person for anything and everything biotech in the government.
Okay, so we're talking about making sure the government is
No.
on the same page. But it's not just about the government, right? I mean, the report also says that this NBCO should be working closely with the people who are actually, in the trenches, the private sector, startups, big companies, and researchers at universities.
Absolutely. It's got to be a collaborative effort. And another really important piece of this first pillar is this idea of an Office of Global Competition Analysis.
So keeping an eye on the competition.
Yeah, exactly. Constantly monitoring what's happening in biotech around the world, gathering data,
Yeah.
making forecasts to understand where the U.S. stands compared to our competitors, especially China. We need to know where we are in this race.
It makes sense. So we can see where we need to, step it up. Yeah.
And to help the government think strategically and for the long term. The report also suggests creating a strategic foresight library. What is that exactly? Like a special library just for biotech?
It'd be more than just books, Think data sets,
Hmm.
scientific journals, and critically, records of past attempts to predict where technology's going. It'd be this resource to help different government departments do their own foresight studies
Okay.
relevant to their missions. For instance, the Department of Agriculture, they could use it to look ahead at future food security challenges connected to biotech, or the DoD to forecast emerging biological threats.
So it's about anticipating those challenges and threats
Sure.
before they even become, full-blown problems.
Or it's about being proactive instead of just reactive. Okay, so let's move on to pillar number 2. This one feels super important. Getting the private sector involved to really scale up U.S. biotech innovations, getting stuff out of the lab and into the real world. The report says our science is strong, but we sometimes struggle with taking those discoveries and turning them into actual products and services.
Yeah, that's spot on. The U.S. has this incredible innovation engine. I mean, just look at venture capital investment in our biotech sector. It dwarfs what China's putting in.
Mm-hmm.
But the final report, it pinpoints some real roadblocks in turning those breakthroughs into, marketable successes. And one of the big ones they point to is regulation.
And they suggest the NBCO, that office we just talked about, could play a big role in streamlining those regulations.
Yeah, making the path to market clearer, more efficient, maybe even carve out some exemptions for biotech products that, we already understand well and that have a proven safety record.
So if a product is essentially the same as something we're already using, and it's made using proven methods, the regulations shouldn't be, a whole different ballgame just because it involves biotech.
Right. The focus should be on truly novel products and
Right.
processes where there are legitimate safety and efficacy concerns.
Makes sense. And then there's this proposal For an independence investment fund, can you tell us about that? How would that work?
So this fund would be managed by private sector experts, but its strategic priorities would be set by the Department of Commerce and its mission to invest in tech startups
Mm.
that are deemed critical for U.S. national and economic security. And get this, a big chunk of it, something like 30%, would be dedicated to supporting emerging biotechnology companies.
Wow.
So it's like good.
Yeah.
This initial government backing will then attract even more private investment, helping these promising startups really scale up.
So it's about bridging that gap between early research funding and the massive amounts of money you need to bring something to market.
Exactly. And the report also talks about using advanced market commitments, AMCs, and offtake agreements to help de-risk the scaling process.
What are those?
So it's like a guaranteed demand for certain biotech products.
Yeah.
Agencies like the Department of Energy, HHS, they'd essentially promise to buy a certain amount of a product once it's developed. This predictability, it makes a huge difference for companies that are trying to scale up, especially for those biotechnologies that haven't found a big market yet.
It takes away some of that uncertainty and risk. When you know there's going to be a buyer for what you're making.
Right?
And what about supporting innovation at the very early stages? You know, those really new ideas, the report talks about that too, right?
Yeah, they suggest making some changes to the SBIR and STTR program,
SBIR and STTR.
Small Business Innovation Research, and Small Business Technology Transfer. These programs are super important because they provide non-dilutive funding to small businesses working on cutting-edge tech, including in biotech. And the final report says, we need to streamline those programs to get the funding out the door faster and also tighten up protections against intellectual property theft, especially by foreign actors.
And the report goes even further. It says we should build a whole network of manufacturing facilities specifically for biotech.
That's a really key infrastructure recommendation. The Department of Energy and the Department of Commerce, they would take the lead.
In setting up these facilities across the country, designed for scaling up bioindustrial products before they hit the market. And on top of that, they recommend that the DOC create a public-private biopharmaceutical manufacturing center of excellence. This center would focus on developing and scaling up new and more efficient ways to manufacture medicines using biotechnology. And ideally, these facilities would be linked to the proposed web of biological data, which we'll talk about later. So making sure we can actually produce these biotech innovations at scale right here in the U.S.
Okay, let's move on to the third pillar, and this brings in a whole other dimension, maximizing the benefits of biotechnology for our defense.
And the final report, it paints this really compelling picture of how biotech could transform military operations. Imagine being able to produce, fuel, food, vital medicines, even synthetic blood on demand, right there on the front lines.
Wow.
That would completely change our reliance on long and vulnerable supply chains.
Talk about operational reach and resilience.
Right.
And it's not just logistics.
Right.
The report also talks about improved battlefield awareness.
Yeah.
And even advances in stealth tech.
Absolutely. Biological sensors. They could give us real-time, highly sensitive threat detection and advancements in things like dynamic biological camouflage. And wearable biosensors could give our troops a huge edge. In terms of stealth and survivability, it really makes you rethink how biology can support military objectives. But with all this power comes responsibility, right? The report talks about the need for ethical guidelines for using biotech in defense.
Yeah, it's absolutely critical. As these technologies become more and more sophisticated, we need a strong ethical framework to guide their development and use in a military context.
And the report also emphasizes the need for sustained funding for the biotechnology for materials and manufacturing program. They call it BioMade.
Yeah, BioMade is doing some really important work supporting companies that are developing these cutting-edge biotechnologies that have national security applications. They need stable funding to keep de-risking these technologies and getting these mission-critical products and processes into the hands of our warfighters. The report recommends ongoing oversight of BioMade's efforts to create a network of facilities that can help pre-commercial bioindustrial companies meet the specific needs of the DoD.
So it sounds like to really get these new biotech products adopted by the military, some changes might be needed in how the military buys things.
Exactly. The report recommends updating military specifications or mil-specs to make it easier for biotech companies to meet those standards. They also suggest that the DoD should enter into those advanced market commitments and offtake agreements we talked about earlier, but this time specifically for strategically important biotechnology products.
So providing that guaranteed market to help drive innovation. And then the last piece of this defense pillar is all about training and preventing misuse of biotechnology.
Yeah, mandatory training on biotech and biosecurity for all DoD personnel and national security personnel.
Yeah.
It's essential. They need to understand both the capabilities and the risks of these technologies. And the report also stresses we've got to prevent our adversaries, specifically China, from misusing U.S. biotechnology.
And that includes being really careful about research activities that could violate international agreements like the Biological Weapons Convention.
Right.
Okay, let's shift gears now to the fourth pillar. Out-innovating our strategic competitors, so basically staying ahead of the game. In terms of biotech research and development,
And a big part of that is biological data. The report highlights how crucial high-quality biological data is for making discoveries, especially with the rise of artificial intelligence. But the U.S. right now doesn't have a central, easy-to-access repository for this kind of data.
it's like pieces of a puzzle scattered all over the place.
Right.
So what's the solution?
The final report proposes the creation of a web of biological data, the WOBD. It would be this online platform where researchers could go to access high-quality, AI-ready biological data from federally funded research, and it would all be in one place, breaking down those data silos, making it easier for researchers to find, combine, and analyze large data sets.
So accelerating the pace of discovery.
Exactly.
But just having the data isn't enough.
Right. The report talks about the need for standards, so that this data can actually be used by AI. Yeah, that's where NIST comes in, the National Institute of Standards and Technology. They'd be responsible for developing those standards and frameworks to make sure that biological data is truly AI-ready. That means consistent formatting, clear labeling, and making sure that different data sets can work together. Interoperability is key.
Now, this next one I found really interesting. The report proposes a sequencing public lands initiative led by the Department of Interior. What's the thinking there? Why are we sequencing public lands?
It's about tapping into the vast biological diversity that we have right here in the U.S. This initiative would systematically collect genomic data from all the plants, animals, fungi, bacteria found on our public lands. This would create this huge amount of new data, which would be added to the WOBD.
So it's about understanding biodiversity, but also maybe finding new sources of inspiration for biotechnology.
Absolutely. And it could also inform conservation efforts and create valuable educational opportunities.
It's like unlocking the biological secrets of our own backyard. But the report also raises a really important point about data security, especially in relation to China.
Yeah, given China's massive investments in genetic sequencing and data collection, we need to be really careful. The report stresses the need for strong oversight and security measures to prevent China from getting access to sensitive U.S. biological data.
Okay, so the report lays out this vision for data, and then it gets even more ambitious with what it calls grand research challenges. The first one is about achieving the ability to predictably engineer biology.
That's a big one. Unlike other engineering fields, like civil or mechanical, where we can pretty much predict how materials will behave, biological systems are a lot more complex. This grand challenge is about putting in the work to get to a point where we can essentially design and program living cells with the same level of predictability as we have when we program computers.
Wow. So we're talking about major breakthroughs in foundational research, measurement techniques, new tools, and really advanced computational models.
Right. It's a multidisciplinary effort. And the report suggests funding should be tied to achieving specific milestones.
Okay, and then the second grand research challenge is focused on revolutionizing biomanufacturing.
So even if we can predictably engineer biology, we then need to be able to scale up production of these bioengineered products in a way that's efficient and cost-effective. This challenge, it's about developing completely new biomanufacturing technologies, focusing on things like developing better chassis organisms, optimizing feedstocks, creating more efficient process technologies, and securing critical inputs. The goal is to create a more distributed, diversified, and flexible biomanufacturing capability right here in the U.S.
So we're not just reliant on a handful of centralized facilities.
Exactly.
And then finally, under this pillar, the report talks about the need for safe, secure, and responsible innovation.
The report says the executive branch needs a more coordinated approach to overseeing biotechnology innovation, to make sure it's being done safely and responsibly.
So that means combining the latest scientific understanding with evidence-based policymaking and effective enforcement.
Right, and being able to adapt to new risks as they emerge. Things like developing standardized procedures for screening synthetic genes and potentially a more comprehensive licensing system for high-containment laboratories.
Okay, so that's innovation. But none of this is possible without the right people. Which brings us to pillar number 5, building the biotechnology workforce of the future.
And the report. It really emphasizes how urgently we need skilled people across the board, not just research scientists, but also technicians, policy experts, business development folks, people who can drive innovation.
So it's not just about people in lab coats.
No, it's much broader than that.
Yeah.
And to make this happen, the Green Hour report says we need a national biotechnology workforce framework led by NIST in partnership with the Office of Personnel Management, OPM.
So this framework would lay out all the different types of biotech jobs and the specific skills needed for each one.
Right, it would be like a blueprint for building the biotech workforce of the future. And the report, it has some specific recommendations for how to get more people with those skills into government.
Like what?
Well, they say OPM should provide clearer guidance to federal agencies on how to use existing hiring authorities to recruit people with biotech expertise. And they also encourage expanding public-private talent exchange programs where you have people from industry coming into government for a while.
Yeah.
And government employees going to the private sector.
So sharing knowledge and experience.
Right. And the report also highlights the need for what they call bioliteracy across the federal government, especially in agencies that deal with national security.
And I guess that means mandatory training on biotechnology and biosecurity.
Exactly. And not just for the DoD, but also agencies like the Department of Homeland Security and others whose missions are increasingly impacted by advances in biotechnology.
Right.
And they also say, we need more people with security clearances who are working on biotech issues, and that we need to maintain a network of those cleared experts, even if they're no longer in government. And they also recommend expanding the number of biotech professionals in the Department of State to strengthen our diplomatic efforts in this area.
So making sure that expertise in biotechnology is embedded throughout the government.
Right. And the report doesn't forget about Congress. They say lawmakers need a deeper understanding of these complex issues to make informed decisions.
So how do we do that?
They recommend strengthening hiring authority for the Congressional Research Service, CRS. They want to formally codify and increase the dedicated funding for the GAOs, Science, Technology Assessment and Analytics Office, the SDAA. And they even propose creating a new office, the Office of the Congressional Science and Technology Advisor, the OCSTA. It would be a more coordinated source of scientific and technical advice directly for Congress.
Wow. So really bolstering the expertise.
Yeah.
On Capitol Hill.
Yeah. And to build a pipeline of future talent. The report suggests some pretty innovative educational initiatives.
Like what?
Well, there's this grant program run jointly by the National Science Foundation, the NSF, and the Department of Education. It would focus on advancing bioliteracy at all levels of education and creating pathways for students to move into biotech careers. And they also propose a biotechnology scholarship for service program, which would provide financial assistance to students in biotech fields in exchange for a commitment to work in government or public service after they graduate. Yeah. And finally, the report addresses this really tricky issue of attracting the best talent from around the world while also protecting U.S. technology.
Yeah, that's a tough one.
The report recommends a complete review and optimization of the vetting process for foreign nationals who want to work in the U.S. biotech sector.
So making sure it's rigorous, but also efficient.
Right. The goal is to prevent technology theft, but also make sure we can keep attracting the brightest minds from everywhere to contribute to our innovation and our economy.
Okay, last but not least, pillar number 6. Mobilizing the collective strengths of our allies and partners. Because the U.S. can't do this alone, right?
Definitely not. The report stresses that we need to expand our biotechnology diplomacy.
Okay.
And that includes commercial diplomacy to open up markets for U.S. biotech products and regulatory diplomacy to work with allies on setting shared standards and norms.
And when it comes to data, sharing data with allies could be a game changer.
Absolutely. The report specifically recommends that the State Department should work on setting up reciprocal biological data sharing agreements with close allies like the UK, Australia, Japan, South Korea, recognizing that each of these countries has its own unique and valuable biological data.
And for defense applications of biotech, the report says, we should leverage NATO.
Right. Encourage NATO members to combine their demand and maybe even pool their purchasing power. For biotech products, that would create a much larger, more stable market and incentivize innovation within the alliance.
Makes sense. And then finally, the report talks about the need for the U.S. to lead the way in shaping international standards for biotechnology and tackling the thorny issue of export controls.
Absolutely. We need to be pushing for international norms and standards that reflect our shared values. And the report calls for a strategy to harmonize multilateral export controls, recognizing that existing agreements may not be adequate for dealing with the unique challenges of emerging biotechnologies.
So this final report, it really lays out a comprehensive strategy across all these different areas. As we wrap up our deep dive, what's the big takeaway? What's the message that people should remember?
I think the key takeaway is there's enormous opportunity here, but also a real sense of urgency. The report makes it very clear that U.S. leadership in biotech isn't just a nice to have, it's essential for our national security and for our ability to influence the world.
And the 6 pillars. Prioritizing biotech nationally, mobilizing the private sector, maximizing its use in defense, out-innovating our competitors, building the workforce, and working with our allies. That's the roadmap to getting there.
And remember that 3-year window wouldn't a lot of time to waste.
So as you think about all of this, we want to leave you with this. Imagine the world in 2030, or even further out. How will biotechnology shape your life, our economy, global power? And who will be leading those advances? What role do you see for the United States in this future? It's a lot to consider. But it's crucial as we enter this new era of biotechnology. Thanks for joining us. We'll see you next time.